I mean, this is kind of a transitional piece of the discussion, so maybe I can throw this in there. Um, so yeah, in fact, what I was planning to do, actually, I'll just start. What I'm planning to do, actually, is as we've done in the previous iterations of this workshop, is really take the opportunity to read through some of the texts with this distinguished company. Um, and I think I'm pretty much in agreement with Chris on the premises of that. In other words, maybe the intractability of any of these authorship divisions or categorizations, whether in pericopes or in Pien. Um, I'll raise two little questions about that by way of getting into it, because I'm actually going to sort of direct our focus more toward the collageist, a term I also like to use for this. Maybe thinking like, you know, a found object sculptor.
Mm.
Um, and I've also used that metaphor of the online discussion thread, talking even about the Tao Te Ching, and where we know also from the Guodian that we had different arrangements or orderings of the text floating around, right? And what constitutes a unit is pretty unstable. Um, and I was also, you know, you can think about a text like the Analects too, in a way, which can seem pretty disconnected. Um, but I think two things come to mind about that. One, or three maybe. One, I totally agree with the 100 flowers blooms. I think it's a very valid question to ask about trying to think of the pericopes individually, and which means a way of sort of focusing on their conditions of production, right? Which is to say, even if we don't know, can't identify an author, we're thinking about meaning production as linked to authorship. You know, in other words, it means something that the author meant it meant. But as we've had in this discussion coming up, these recontextualizations seem to play a very big role, and this would apply to the Tao Te Ching, and this would apply to the Analects. And another interesting example to consider is the question of sequencing as a cultural trope. You know, and so what I have in mind there, I mean, sort of thinking about legends around the ordering of the 64 hexagrams, for example, where again you have found material, which is very ambiguous, and where a sagely hand, in other words, the real work, the real philosophical or the significant work, is the work of putting them in a particular sequence or changing the sequence or altering a sequence, right? So um, I'd like to give us a little more, see if another of the flowers that can bloom here as we read together is to try to think about that sequencing a little bit more. And in that case, the intractability of how we divide this, um, among the many ways we can think about this, is one that has the distinct advantage of having indisputable and long-standing cultural and philosophical significance, which is the 33 chapter Zhuangzi, right? Right. So one thing we do know is that for many, many centuries, this was looked at as a text, read as a text, commented on as a text, a complete text. Sometimes questions were raised about authorship of individual pieces, of course, but I guess what I'm trying to say is for us, I don't think we need to connect coherence to any imputation of authorship or even intention. And I would say that even about, I mean, we can as a kind of heuristic, we might think about the anonymous editor. Maybe it's Guoxiang, maybe it's someone else, maybe there are kind of sub-editors, maybe there's groups, we don't really know. But anyway, we end up with this 33 chapter book that has legs, right? That has some kind of staying power, and that seems to snowball around it a lot of effects. So looking not at from the side of the cause of the text, but from the side, maybe this is a Tobias theme, the reception of the Zhuangzi and its significance culturally, I think we have to give some fair play to the 33 chapter Zhuangzi. Now that does mean we're going to be forced into a very uncomfortable position a lot of the time. And one of the things, you know, another thing that occurs to me, this may have been the third point, I'm not keeping such good track. But you know, you talk about the Mozi and the Shunzi, texts like that. When we are trying to make decisions about what is and is not compatible between two positions expressed in different parts of the text, it seems to me. Well, I'll put this as a question: do we have a kind of meta discourse in those texts on the one hand, and in the Zhuangzi, maybe in the commentarial tradition, maybe even in the Lunyu, which raises a different model or raises questions about our models. I mean, about what counts as coherent or the same position. After all, we have in some of the Zhuangzi material some discussion and thought about seeing things from the point of view of their sameness, seeing things from the point of view of their difference. Might these factor into what we consider an editor or a somewhat whoever was working on this text considered licit for inclusion, even when there is, if taken separately, hugely contradictory positions expressed. In other words, if you have a theory about contradiction expressed in the material and what the criteria of acceptability of alternate perspectives, how they might unify, what unity is, what even for us, maybe what we consider coherence to be, what counts as coherent. That might be another thing to take into account when we look at the organization of these texts, right? So I float that as an idea, which, and I really want to do this more as a discussion or a roundtable as we look at chapter 12. We've been assigned these by Pian and not by pericope, or even by theme or string. And I like that idea of making sort of one of the basic ways we group these in terms of not positions, but conversations that Chris suggested. I think that's very useful. But this time I want to try to maybe also push a little bit at the boundaries of the Pian and try to in the opposite direction. In other words, outward. And so I need to share my screen. Am I permitted to do that?
Ask a question or jump
Please.
in? I like this direction, but one thing it makes me think of is the monkey trainer, the Zhao San Musa story, right? And it sort of seems like this is entering deeply into the psychology of the monkeys, and it's sort of. But I'm curious if you see a connection there, or if because it feels like that story solves the problem more serenely than this sequence does. This sequence seems very discouraged.
Yeah, right. And so that's super interesting question. No, I agree with you. I think the monkey story, at least one way of reading that has a long history, is to read it as about this exact question, right? How do you get liang xing and all that stuff, right? How do you get along with the weird shifeis, or xiu yu tianjun or he zhi shifei, right? Harmonizing with the shifeis of others, right?
But you give them what you want.
Those shifeis are very. What's that?
You give the monkeys what they want. You just switch it around.
Give the monkeys
right? You
what
just
they
go
want.
along.
That's right. That's right. But those the interesting thing is that may be why the text is trying to argue for that's zhiqi or bu zhiqi r, right? Because that sounds like, well, in individual encounters, you go along with whoever you encounter, and it must be said in the a lot of the stories of the inner chapters, it seems that that's the kind of picture we have, right? You have somebody with a particular situation, a particular task, or having to deal with particular interlocutors, right? Rather than the conventional values, right? And they are able to sort of move around them. I don't know. It doesn't exclude that, right? But that doesn't seem to be the focus, right? So. And then if you look at 8, 9, 10, they are very much very outspoken about whether it's conventional values, but also very interestingly, Yang Mo. And I have a thought about that too, is that, it's one of those interesting places where the Ru have fallen out as the targets of critique, even in those Yang Mo references in 8, 9, and 10. And Yang Mo are both in their opposite ways, kind of almost like as Mengzi would have it, right? Both deviating from conventional usage, proposing some novel moral position, right? So someone who is opposing the crowd in some way. At least maybe that is how this is being construed here. So yeah, I think it's picking up. I think it's picking up on the Jiaoshan Musi motif, right, which is very central to things going on earlier in the book. But I'm interested in whether we can. This is an attempt, perhaps a failed attempt, to read the affirmation of governmental, even Confucian-friendly moral values and political structures as simply extending that principle more consistently, or more, at least more thoroughgoingly.
This is just a comment, but I think that your interpretation of that passage is a good example of the question of how much weight we should give to the PN, right? Because that theme of the critique of trying to escape the social structures of the world, I think, is convincingly there in those other passages. That last one reads more naturally to me as saying, not affirming convention, but just saying, we're not going to try to fix the world, right? But
you mean that whole last bit?
That whole last bit, yeah. It doesn't, because the starting lines don't clearly say this is conventional wisdom. It just lays it down as like a truth, right?
Yeah.
And so I read it much less clever than you read the passage, I guess. That's how I've been reading it. It seems a little too clever, I guess, to be the way that you're reading the passage. But if we take it seriously in that context, right, then that makes more sense to read it that way, right? So if we read it in line with they can do one but not two, then it makes more sense to say, well, there's something more complicated going on in this passage. Because we wouldn't expect it to just have a straight up critique of convention then, given these other things that have been said in the same chapter. So I think this is a case where there's just a question of how much weight do we put on the overall context of the pericope.
Pericope, yeah. I totally agree. I mean, let's keep that very much in sight, right? So I don't think this is the better interpretation or the right one. I think we, dealing with this text, we got to run both programs, you know? So, right, if you look at just this chunk as a chunk, you're going to have a lot of different things to say about it. If you're looking at it as recontextualized here, and I'm sort of thinking about this from the point of view of a commentator in the Wei Jin period or something, right? So they're going to, how do they look at a sudden change of topic? Well, they are developing ways of seeing implicit pivot points that connect up, right? And again, this goes back to the question about fruitfulness and fruits, right? I mean, I think there are things to be gained in both ways of doing this, and probably best of all doing them both, right? Which is to say, the interpretive art, which let's make this really clear. I think you could do this with, a bunch of random words thrown on the refrigerator magnets, right? Definitely could. But that's what a lot of the, one of the ways in which new ideas get generated and then worked out, by having this sort of forced constraint imposed that, well, I got to assume this makes some sense, right? It's a particular kind of reasoning. The other, that I think we would neglect at our peril when trying to understand why a text like this circulates and affects and influences and is influenced in the ways it has been. So, I mean, what interests me most, of course, is the way in which this might generate new thinking about what counts as coherence or oneness or an entity to begin with, right? Any other?
Hi, Brook. So prior to, first of all, I'm really happy with this reading of seeing two opposing attitudes in the Zhuangzi and not thinking of them as a problem to solve. So this question relates to your earlier point about that. It's not a problem to solve, but it's maybe they are put together to offer a balance. So it's not a contradiction that we should have to make sense of, but actually they are meant to be put together. So my question is about that. I don't know if it's a question or comment. So prior to your presentation, with chapter 11 and chapter 12, these passages that are about not just forgetting the first step, but also doing the second step, like the dialogue between Confucius and the gardener. I read these passages embracing oppositional attitudes along the lines of this imagery of breaking into pieces what is whole. Which also appear actually in these chapters, and actually your translation highlights that better than the C-text translation that you projected. So in chapter 12, we have this imagery of a tree that you break into pieces, and then you make ritual vessels out of it, and your translation renders it as the ritual vessels are not different than the vestiges in the ditch. And because they both lost their inborn nature. And in that sense, Robert Jur is not that different than men of righteous character. And then in chapter 11 too, there is a similar imagery of breaking something whole into pieces, and how each piece actually is worse off, but maybe not. I'm reading too much into it. It is about when you search for the substance of things, like Ujir Shirye, it is not different than the remainder of things. Ujir Sanye. So it doesn't oppose to the reading of balance, right? Comprehensiveness and balance could also be read together, but this actually ties into this issue of coherence with these PNs, and it's not necessarily coherence about attitudes, but also taking one imagery and then using that to read another passage, and maybe they were put together because these passages about uniting two attitudes and the Kongzi and the gardener dialogue maybe actually relates back to this imagery of breaking something whole into pieces. But I was wondering if you also thought about how these passages that you kind of projected maybe might relate to that other imagery that we see in chapter 11 and 12.
Yeah, and which is also, it's pretty similar to the trope in 8 about the two shepherds, right? One loses, who both lose their sheep, right? So it's again that same idea, right? The passage Sonia's referring to is the very next one at the very end of the chapter about chopping up the wood, the tree, and making goblets, and then
that one. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's super important, and that's the very next passage, right? But that one's so interesting because again, you could see that as, I mean, again, that's where the language looks to be most like what we had in 8, and that motif is very similar to 8, right? Everyone, I don't know if everyone remembers. I'm sure you guys all remember, but I just remind you, right? I mean, the shepherd boys, one was gambling and one was studying, right? And they both lose their sheep, and that sort of middle position, neither the good nor the bad, it's almost the same exact language, right? Slightly different metaphor used for it. So in some way, that's really interesting point. I mean, in other words, those are two seemingly incompatible things, right? Like there's an either or that is sort of being conventionally accepted. The sages are good and Robert Jur is bad. And then we're going, no, those two opposites, actually, we're going to give you a point of view from which those two are identical. Basically, there's no significant difference between them, and they're contrasted to this other thing, which is the nature in that chapter, right? So there's some similarity there for sure, right? In other words, but on the other hand, I don't know. I don't know how we would then. Is there a way you see of like? I mean, this is probably, to Frank's point, way too clever. But you could.
Possibly.
But I mean, you could extend that to say, okay, you had two, which were opposites, and then you posited one, which was not them. Now, as the text says in that passage, just keep doing that, right? Continue the same principle of where you have a two that appear to be opposites, no longer seeing them that way, and then it's going to be the opposition between opposition and non-opposition, and then that is sort of what's played on in that. Do you agree with the crowd? Do you disagree with the crowd? Right? Right? So that's a very, very, very charitable reading, though, I think. But I would also say that I wouldn't be at all surprised if you would find that point made by a commentator, right? Something like that, at that level of abstraction, yeah. Any other thoughts about that? I mean, so as I say, I don't have any big conclusions about this at all. I'm just sort of trying to play out and float some ways to try to think about the kind of reception and interpretive stance that might have been evoked by this text as it is, even more than I want to really think about how it got that way, right? So here we have this text. It's supposed to be by someone cool and awesome, traditionally, right? So it's supposed to be by someone who's not insane. Okay, so now what do you do, right? So how do you digest that interpretively? I kind of wanted to look at another real standout passage here, which is this sort of mini cosmogony or sort of, origin of things story, which I don't think we have any example in any of the previous chapters here. And I don't know where we would have anything quite this. It reads like something from, you have things like this in 23, I guess, but a lot of the kind of pieces you get in, say, Huainanzi and later texts like that. What I have in mind is, everyone see my screen now? Is this bit, this Tai Chu You thing, just that much. Again, this looks so obviously like a random introduction or interruption, right? It's just out there, sitting out there like a big hot dog sitting out there. Has no obvious connection to the previous story. It's not in a narrative frame unless you would like to throw it in there, which is very possible with the previous story. All the little dialogues, I think, map pretty well into just this basic motif of trying to connect some form of government or some kind of restraint or some kind of convention or institution or to recognizable motifs of stillness or wu-wei or something like that, or nothingness. And so maybe this is in there for that reason. But again, it's a good test case for trying to discern what sort of I'm wary of the word principle of organization, but again, I think of this more like a junkyard sculpture. There are kind of aesthetic reasons to stick one thing over here and then another very different thing over here, perhaps, rather than like someone who is attempting to make a chapter that gives a coherent, quote unquote, argument. So this one is just fun to look at, and I'd like to read it with you guys. How would that be? Just to see how we make sense of that. Or should we? Or so, Zhuangzi, what do we have? 20 minutes left?
Yeah, 21 minutes left. 20 minutes, about 20 minutes left.
Well, it is relevant, and it ends on a note that does tie into this conventionalism, anti-conventionalism theme, sort of unexpectedly. So, why don't we just try to look at this? Tai Chu You Wu, Wu You Wu Ming. Different ways to parse this, right, or interpret this, but maybe in the great beginning, I think my translation is something like, what there was nothing. There was nothing. There was nothing. It's to stress the nothing. You could just say Tai Chu Yo and U or something like that, maybe. But without any being or content or presence, and without any name or identity, right? 一之所起. This is what the one arose from nothingness to one. Can we do that? Continuity or something. There was a oneness, but not yet any form, right? So some kind of, not a contained one. I would take the xing to mean a definite entity that has outer boundaries of some kind, but that the nothingness, from a nothingness arises this some form of continuity or oneness. 无得以生谓之得. So here's one of our familiar plays on de and de, right? When things attained it and thereby came to life or had life, this is called de. This is one of the, so what is it they attain? I assume it is this formless one, which arises out of the nameless nothingness, right? So the one of the few 谓之德, or that we get, to try to specify this changing sense of what de would mean in this context. How about this? 为行者有份, 且然有见, 谓之命. So not yet having any form, but having what? Divisions, having roles, having positions. I find this 且然 really interesting. I take the 且 to mean something like tentatively, right? There's some separation between them, so they're not absolutely snapped off from each other, but there's some kind of, I don't know what to picture here. What do you guys think? Kind of mitosis picture where the things are still connected and there's a sort of ambiguous division between them? Or am I reading too much into that 且然, or should we go with one of the substitutions? But that makes some readable sense to me anyway. 谓之命, that is their allotment of life or their mandate, whatever, right? So if we get de, and then a little more separate, that's just the oneness, the formless oneness, and then some kind of vague separations called ming. Now look at this one. This is going to be xing, 流动而生物, 无称生理, 谓之行. Super interesting, right? I just tried to be literal when I tried to think about 流动. So there's staying and going, or there's a kind of motion that nevertheless retains or continues or preserves itself. And now we have 物, right? We had 生 before, 无得以生, but now we have giving birth to things that, let's discuss, 流动, whatever that means. But interesting to me here too is 无称生理. When the thing is complete, then it generates a li, a structural coherence of some kind, right? So the li seems here not to precede the 无称, but to follow from it, having its own sort of coherence. That's called a physical form, or a definite form. 形体保身各有一则 is great, right? So once you have a physical form, it preserves a spirit. It becomes a container or a receptacle that preserves or protects a spirit, each one having its own style or principles or demeanor or standards or something, right? 一则. That's called the nature. So here we actually have something about this Xing discourse. And all of that's super interesting in its own right. But what I want to get to is this, 心修反德. So cultivating the nature to return to de, so all the way back up the ladder, right? That's from the last term back up to the first term. 德智同于出, so that you get to the point where the virtuosity is the same as it was in the beginning, i.e., I guess, this yo, yo, ming, so on. And by being the same as, I presume that is a carryover, the same as that original form, it is shu. That makes some sense, right? Shu nai da, right? And then look at this. Chirping along with beaks, together with beaks, right? And I just take that, you may remember, there's a couple other references to this beak motif in the Zhuangzi materials. They can be quite mysterious. It makes you think a little bit of the Qiulun thing about the chirping baby birds. But importantly to me here in terms of our current conversation, I think the idea is because shu, then vast, because, and what is the vastness? The vastness is a joining in with the chirping of beaks, which I take to be some kind of image, perhaps, of all the, similar to maybe the opening of the Qiulun, the various voices. And this is where, again, I would say the point of contact with this question of agreeing with convention has reappeared. So agreeing with or chiming in or chirping along with all the beaks. And when that is done, that is yu tian di wei he. What you are joining with is heaven and earth themselves. So again, a justification perhaps, and then you get stupid, right? Right? You get stupid and you know you're stupid. Shu wei xuan de tong yu da shun and so on, right? Usual kind of stuff. So not being so smart that you are able to critique or stand opposed like the yang and the mo, perhaps, but something about joy, I must admit that's a surprising one. I don't know. What do you think? Let's just, in our remaining time, I'm just curious what other people think of that passage.
Brook, can
Do you want it on the screen?
Yeah.
Sure.
It's just a very small. Oh yeah, it's just a very small possibility suggestion maybe. So 雨天与什么什么为和, I think that's no problem there. So that means like being in tune with something or being, how do you translate that? Yes. But the first one, he, and then what is this called? The beak and the ming, right? The he, the first he, couldn't that be causatively closing? Of course, I give it a very different meaning here, but if you actually look at the Shouwen Jiezi, which of course is also an interpretation, he is defined as the closing of the lips, just the closing, shutting a mouth. So making them stop. Yeah. I mean, but of course that it would be very different in semantically from the other he, but and maybe that's why they become stupid. You just shut them up.
Yeah, it could mean shut your own beak, right? Shut your yap, kind of thing, I suppose. Yeah, that's plausible, right? You have to read that different from this he, I suppose, but
Shut your beak and ming.
That's possible.
Could
and then it would be the opposite view, right? Either shut one's own yap would be like, I no longer push my critique, right? You could also read it that way, right? Once you're da, shu nai da, then the beak closes. That's interesting. I don't know. I like it. But you could read it either one's own beak or the beaks of all the other chirpers, I suppose. I'm curious. So, Zhong, you must have an opinion on this one.
So you
Not yet.
connect.
Not yet.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, actually, you can continue.
Yeah, so you connect so shu nai da, and then da you think of da as he, what is that character? Tuan ma ming. But couldn't it be that the da refers to yu tian di wei he, and then the shu refers to this he, the beaks there?
Oh, I see.
So you get you get an A-B that kind of structure.
Yeah, but I mean, this one says when the beaks are closed. I take that to be equating them, no? So this is, close the beaks or join the beaks, and this is when the beaks are closed. Then, I read it, 于天地为和, that which you are joining with is this, right? I mean, this is the process of doing that, and this is what happens when that is done, isn't it?
Yes. So couldn't it be that what was just highlighted in green? Couldn't
Yes,
that be
yes,
what
yes.
is meant? Yes. So this is shu sope. So couldn't this be like shu or something like that? And then the result of that is if
I
you
see.
shu, then 与天地为和, and that's then da, something like that.
Yeah.
not sure.
Oh, I agree. No, I think that is what it's trying to say, right? So to join with all these beaks would be plausibly shu-ish, right? In other words, you no longer have one particular divided off position or goyo iza kind of thing, and therefore can join. I mean, the connection between shu and he is I think straightforward. Yeah, but I'm intrigued by that idea that you could turn this one around in at least 3 different ways. I don't know. I just went with my intuition on this.
Hey, Brook, yeah, I also found this really interesting passage. For Liu Dong in particular, I was wondering something like when the motion is arrested, along the lines of, like in the cosmogonic process, like along the lines of Xuan Ying's reading, which is, what does he say? 动即造化之流行，少流于此，即生一物。So just
Oh, a little pause in the motion,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I like that too. I mean, I can't see how there can be this is one of those really fun interpretive things, right? Because, kind of the problem Chris brought up before, like, we're just going to have a bunch of guesses here, and we're going to try to like fit them into the context, which we will construct around like, what is the point? But I like that one. So there's a universal process of dong that we've been talking about where there's no fixed divisions, and then there's these kind of nodal pause places, and then you get a thing. Yeah. Tobias?
Brook, if you follow I mean, you're right. I mean, it reads like totally like the Huayan answer, right? I mean, like it the interesting thing about it, it doesn't have an intertextual parallel with the Huayan answer, even though it sounds 100% like it, right? But I think, what you can do, if you follow Huayan answer ideas here just for a second, right? When you look at it, I mean, Tai Chu, right, is a typical term that it's used. And so you have first a cosmogony that stops at the moment once a Xing is created, right? And then what happens afterwards is the return movement. So basically what it does is, right, like you have the creation of a thing, and then the practice of returning back to the origin of the universe, which is a typical thing, right, that the Huayan answer claims a Shengren or a Zhenren should perform. And it literally actually utilizes the Huayan answer, utilizes the term fan xiu, not xiu fan, but fan xiu in this specific context. So, I mean, if you read it that way, right, what it does is basically describing in the latter part certain kind of processes of how you return back to Tai Chu. I mean, it literally construes this way. And if we think of the Ming at the end, not as just sound, but also as noise, and that discerns things, right, in relation to Yo Ming that you had at the beginning, then closing the mouth and turning basically off language as a possibility is an integral aspect, right, to move back to this Tai Chu part again. So I think it plays actually with the what is it? How to say it at the beginning, where it says like Wu You Wu Ming, right?
Yeah.
That at the beginning you have to be Wu Ming. That is also is Wu Ming, right? In this moment, that it also means no sound. And I think these kind of constructions of these crossing cosmogonies and the coming out and back again aspects is really very typical for the Huayan answer, and I would not be surprised if the same kind of strategy just shows up here.
Yeah. I mean, this
right,
is
so we don't know what.
Outlier.
Sorry, that interrupted you. Say it again. Sorry.
I was going to say it's such an outlier in the context of the Zhuangzi, but it has a big future in Huainanzi talk, right? I mean, you're
absolutely.
Going to see this yeah.
Oh, so Can you explain more about the Ming, the mandate or allotment of life, and that passage? I am not still
Well,
clear.
I can, yeah. I mean, I'll just we can look at it together for sure. So let's see. So we have a progression, right? De, Ming, Xing, Xing. And again, interestingly enough, if this is a sort of quasi-temporal progression, right? Xing comes last, right? Isn't that interesting, right? It doesn't precede Ming, and it doesn't even precede the physical body, right? This is worth looking, comparing to the analogous type of passages in Huainan Zen later, right? And I mean, is this how much of an outlier this actually is? But so I mean, I don't know. I would read it. The Ming, again, the Qieran Wu Jian. So there's a fen, but there's no space between them, right? That they are tentative and not without gap. So how do we picture that? So they're divisions, but I mental picture for me is something like this. You have a one, and then you have, I don't know how to think about the Wu De Sheng, but then you have Wei Xing You Fen. You could have like this, but they're still, again, I think of sort of cell mitosis or something. And then when they actually separate off, you have Xing. I don't know.
Why don't you think of it as sexual?
As sexual?
Yeah.
Can you
two bodies coming together? When they're together, there's no the wujian.
Oh, 为心者有分，且让无间. So temporarily there is no gap between them.
Brook.
Okay, but how do you read the 为心者有分 then?
And that one is a bit trickier, right? But if you think about it later, right? 流动而生物. I mean,
yeah.
It talks about like creating things,
generation,
right?
gestation. Yeah, you could. It's interesting.
Yeah, Brook.
So,
sorry. I can see the one hand from the online participant. I think Misha had. So do you?
Hi.
Yeah.
Just in regard to this question of the cosmogony and the Huainanzi connection, when you were talking about the anti-conventional flip, one of the things that popped in my head was Michael Pewett's violent misreading paper he wrote, a while back, in criticizing Huainanzi as taking Zhuangzi and completely inverting its purpose. But it seems like in the Zhuangzi text, it already does that move, right? And so we're seeing that here with the conventional, the passage you're talking about, the anti-convention or anti-convention, and maybe this is the anti-cosmogony passage.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, this is a good question, and maybe some of the excavated texts are relevant here too. For how much, going back to maybe Chris's model of what conversation is this a part of, right? Like, and we don't know how to date this really, but I mean, what's the rival cosmogony, right? Is it Tai Sheng Shui, or is it, Xing Zi Ming, Ming Zi Xing Chu, or Xing Zi Ming Chu, right, or something? I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think. But maybe if it's in response to them, because the thing is, it's not so obvious that you have any cosmogony in the parts of the text if we're reading from, the given 33 chapters forward. You have that weird bit in chapter 6 a little bit, but it's nothing like this, right? So
right. I mean, I think
what he's talking back to in this way.
The passage, what was the one that the Qi Wu Lin passage? 有时也者.
Right. That Huainanzi makes, chapter 2 of Huainanzi.
Right? But so it presents this kind of similar structure of the progression, and then it critiques it, right? I mean, I think that's at least
maybe,
I
yeah. I mean, I always read the one in Qi Wu Lun as a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the idea of a beginning.
Right.
But-
No, and I think that's kind of Pewett's argument, which is it is a critique of this idea that you can lay this out in a logical or
Right.
using language to lay out what happened, this kind of origin of the cosmos. But then this passage is then used to explain how the universe was created in the Huainanzi. And so, but I mean, this is where you get the anti-cosmogony flip.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes, now we can do a cosmogony, but it's going to be in the service of this return cultivation kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like
That's
that.
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's time's up, but I would like to collect one more last question. Yes.
Then I'm thinking about the Yo Fun still and how that fits in. I'm wondering if you could think of that as something more like vectors of force, something like that. I'm thinking in the Hengshan, there's a suggestion that maybe seeking precedes the actual formation of things. It's a very confusing line, but it seems like that. So it would make sense in the progression if with this, you have this oneness, this duh, and the first stage is some kind of differentiation of forces. So not like a splitting into two, but then those forces, when they get arrested in certain ways, you get sort of like little eddies of force, and that's a thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know, that might be pushing fun, the meaning of fun too much, but fun does have a sense of like duties or roles, like not just of division,
Yes.
right? But a sense of activities as well. So maybe that would work. Logically, at least,
Yeah, I
it
see
makes
what you
sense
mean.
of the progression between the oneness and actual things. You get some kind of differentiation of forces or a kind
Right.
of something like that. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. I mean, maybe we could just say like, without, they obviously didn't have the idea of force per se, but like, if you read that fen sort of as a verb, right? You'll fening, right? So there is some dividing going on or some polarization, something like that. And it's very possible to read it like that. How would you then read the qieran wujian? So the forces are like up against each other. Well,
Yeah, right. Yeah, that they're not separated from each other.
yeah.
Why
They're
you
not
would call that
self-standing.
Ming seems weird, though.
It does, right?
Oh, yeah, right. If you take Ming more in the sense of life, that would, yeah.
Right. You got to distinguish that from sheng, right? Because we have de and then de, ming, xing, and xing. Yeah, right. So there's de before life in that sense, right? Allotment of life or something.
Yeah.
But life would work well with your force idea, yeah. Right. Life force.
I would say also the Hengshan is similar in putting something like, it maybe uses the word Xing, it maybe doesn't, but putting it somewhat in the same position, I think.
Yeah.
The Hengshan
Xing
cosmogony.
or xing? The physical form and the relation between physical form and the nature, you mean?
Yeah, right. It's
right.
kind of relatively late in the process.
Right.
In a similar way, I think.
I think you see that quite a lot, actually. I mean, even in like way down the line, there's the, it's even in the, like, I think it's basically, well, even when the Xing precedes, a lot of things come after the Xing, like Shen sometimes, even in like Zhou Duni or somebody,